am an I'm an associate director within International Student and Scholar Affairs. I'm joined this evening by my lovely colleague, Dulce Cordova, who will be answering the questions that you have throughout this session. If you do have questions, you are welcome to put them in the Q&A feature of the Zoom meeting. Please don't put them in the chat. Please go ahead and put them in the Q&A. Any questions there will get answered. I do ask that you ask questions that are relevant to the part of the PowerPoint that we are on. But if you have pending questions at the end of the presentation, we will most certainly stick around for a few minutes to answer any pending questions. So welcome to tonight's session. It is about CPT, Curricular Practical Training. I'm starting tonight with a main takeaways slide. If you take anything away from tonight's presentation, let it be these 5 bullet points. We will address all of these again at the very end of tonight's presentation, but do try to keep in mind these 5 main points. The first main point about CPT is that all off-campus employment activities require work authorization. And this is in general, anything that you're doing off campus will need some sort of work authorization, or at the very least, you should consult with ISSA about any of these activities. These activities can include things like traditional, 9-to-5 employment, things like short-term internships, micro internships. If these are ND-sponsored or promoted experiences, they may not be on campus and may still be considered off-campus employment. Things like self-employment, if you're presenting at a conference, receiving an honorarium, if you're publishing a book and receiving an honorarium, all of these kinds of activities may require work authorization. So this brings us to the second bullet point. Be sure to reach out to ISSA for any off-campus activity. We are your go-to resource for finding out if you need some sort of work authorization. We're happy to kind of review any sort of offer that you've received and kind of advise you best on what the next step is in terms of potentially being able to get work authorization and accept that off-campus activity. The sub-bullet point for this one, I say ISSA webpage. And the reason for that is because all of the information that we're going to cover in tonight's presentation is actually also available to you on our CPT webpage. And Dulce will go ahead and put the link to our CPT webpage in the chat for us. But all this information is covered there. This session is, of course, being recorded, and this recording will be also posted to that webpage by the end of this week. The next one is that your employment, any off-campus employment that you pursue as an F1 student, must be related to your major field of study. If you are a double major, it can be related to either of those majors, but it does have to be related to your major field of study. CPT, Curricular Practical Training, is based on the academic curriculum and not a particular student's desire for employment. What this means is that the primary purpose of your status here in the US as an F1 student is study. And this particular kind of work authorization, CPT, has to be because your curriculum requires the work and not just that you want to work. And then the final bullet point is that not all programs have the option for CPT. CPT is not a given, and it depends on each student's particular program. And if that program has, as a part of its academic curriculum, an option for off-campus internships or field work or something of that nature that would allow you to apply for CPT. So we're going to move into a general overview of CPT. So what exactly is it? What does CPT mean? So CPT stands for Curricular Practical Training. It's a US-based work authorization for either paid or sometimes unpaid practical experience that is first directly related to your major, as we mentioned previously, and second, an integral part of an established curriculum. I really want to draw attention to that first word of CPT, curricular. So this is really where we emphasize that this particular kind of work authorization is based in your academic, your curricular needs. So it does have to be rooted in your particular academic program. It's not just general work authorization. So what do we mean when we say an integral part of an established curriculum? So that's directly from the CPT regulations. So what does that mean? It is any one of these three bullet points. So CPT could be a practical experience that's required of every single student in a particular academic program. An example of this would be something like an education program where the students have to do something like student teaching. It's required for them to complete the degree. Every single student in that program has to do their student teaching in order to complete the degree requirements. CPT could be that you are getting course credit for a work experience and that those credits are counting towards your overall credits to graduate. And then the final option is that this is specifically for master students with a thesis or our PhD students who may be attending. This work is going to directly contribute to your graduate thesis or your dissertation. So if you're a PhD student and you need CPT to do some sort of off-campus research that is going to help you finish your dissertation, then that would be one possible way of applying for CPT. So any number of these three items would count as this integral part of an established curriculum and would make you eligible for curricular practical training. So a big question, how do I know if I'm authorized for CPT? So you'll know that you're authorized when you have a new I-20 with a CPT authorization that has the authorized employer listed on page 2 and the start date of that particular employment period has been reached. The main thing to know about this is that CPT authorization comes in the form of a new I-20. So if you apply for CPT to ISSA, that doesn't mean that you automatically have CPT. We have to issue you a new I-20 with CPT authorization, and that will be the CPT authorization that you present to your employer to be hired for that particular job. So one of the main questions we get from students is, what is the difference between CPT and OPT? So CPT, it must be related to your major. Now, this is actually the same for OPT. Any off-campus employment must be directly related to your major. However, the second bullet point here for CPT, as we've mentioned, it has to be part of the curriculum. It has to be part of your academic program, and typically you're going to have to receive credit. You're taking some sort of class, and in order to meet the objectives of that class, you need to do this particular off-campus opportunity. It's typically tied to course enrollment. For OPT, it is not required for program completion. So OPT, as in its name, is optional, whereas CPT is something that is rooted in the needs of your academic program. For CPT, it's only going to be authorized before your program completion date. Since the work that you're doing has to count towards your program completion, it doesn't make sense for it to be authorized after you graduate. So CPT is only going to be authorized before you complete your program, whereas OPT can be authorized either before or after that program completion. I will note that it is typically authorized after program completion. CPT is authorized by ISSA, so we approve that within our office, which means the processing time is about 5 business days, whereas OPT is actually approved by the US government, a part of the US government called USCIS, and because it's approved through the government, the processing time is going to be approximately 3 months. For CPT, there is no cost to get the authorization. The only cost would be that you need to be registered in that course and get the course credit. For OPT, there is a $470 filing fee. That is a government fee. I did put here under the last bullet point, there are few exceptions to the need for course credit. On one of the previous slides, and we're going to touch on this again, one of the options for being eligible for CPT is if every single student in your program has to complete this kind of internship in order to graduate. If it's required of every single student, then there may not be a course enrollment. There may not be a course that you have to enroll in to get credit in order to apply for CPT. And I will note that ISSA is well aware of those opportunities. And so we know which programs have that requirement. So another question that comes up, so not just what are the differences between CPT and OPT, but one of the questions we get is, if I do CPT, will it impact my OPT? For part-time CPT, which is considered to be 20 hours or less per week, it will not have any impact on your eligibility for OPT. For full-time CPT, which is more than 20 hours per week, this is, first of all, typically only going to be available to you during designated school breaks. You are limited to part-time CPT during the academic year when you're required to be a full-time enrolled student. However, during the summer break, the winter break, I've seen students get CPT for spring break, something like that could be more than 20 hours per week and could be full-time. If you have or if you are authorized for 12 months of full-time CPT, this would make you ineligible for OPT. I will note that there are very few programs at Notre Dame that allow students to get even close to 12 months of full-time CPT. A lot of students will do a few summers of CPT. So you may do like 3 months of full-time CPT, 3 or 6 months of full-time CPT, not going to impact your OPT. So most students, if you're doing CPT during the semester, you're capped at that 20 hours per week. Again, part-time CPT has no impact on your OPT. So in very few situations will being authorized for CPT actually impact your OPT eligibility. So just a note, and we will bring this up again before the end of the presentation, but you should never work without authorization. Off-campus employment activities can be very risky if you don't have the appropriate authorization. This working without authorization is a violation of your F1 status, and this could lead to a termination of the F1 status and you having to depart the United States as soon as possible. This could impact the future of your OPT eligibility, and it could impact any future immigration aspirations that you may have in the United States. So never work without authorization. So moving on to the next section about employment and degree requirements. So again, we want to define our terms here. So what exactly is employment? What do we mean when we say employment? The US government defines employment as the rendering of service for any form of compensation. The reason that we emphasize any form of compensation is because it's not necessarily just a paycheck, right? Something like financial compensation, salary, an honorarium, a stipend, of course, this would be monetary compensation. However, if your employer is subsidizing your meals, your housing, your transportation, your lodging, if they're giving you gift cards, if you're getting shares or stocks in the company because of the work that you're doing, all of these things would be considered compensation. And so in the eyes of the US government, getting any of these things for the work that you're doing would mean that position is employment, and then therefore would require some sort of work authorization. So we put this slide in here because we really want to draw your attention to the fact that monetary compensation, getting money like a paycheck, isn't the only reason that you would need CPT authorization. So really important to remember about CPT employment. So CPT authorization is 1, employer specific. You are authorized for a particular employer. 2, it is time specific. You are authorized for a particular employer for a particular period of time. When you request CPT authorization, you have to let us know the duration of time that you will be working. So it is employer and time specific. And finally, it is job specific, meaning that you are authorized to do a specific job for that employer for that period of time when we authorize you for CPT. So because it is employer, time, and job specific, if you change jobs or positions, or if you move from full-time to part-time, any of these things would require a new CPT authorization. You would need to resubmit that request to ISSA and get a new authorization in the form of a new I-20. Just a sub-bullet point that your academic advisor has to sign off on that CPT request. So this will also be part of that process every time. If you are working for a company and they want to extend your employment, maybe they want you to stay on an additional week or 2 weeks, because CPT is time specific, that means you would need to, again, submit a new CPT authorization request to ISSA in order to extend that employment authorization. This also means that your employment with that employer, that company, must end when that authorization period ends. So if I have a student who has applied for a summer internship from May 30th until July 15th, and I authorize their CPT from May 30th to July 15th, and maybe their employer comes back and says, oh, I'd actually like you to continue working for the rest of July. They have to submit a new CPT authorization to extend that end date of their CPT from July 15th to July 31st. So that would require a new CPT request. And then again, just to reiterate that monetary compensation doesn't necessarily impact whether or not you need authorization, because you may be getting compensation in some other way. Again, if you have questions or you're reviewing your offer and you're not sure, you are welcome to come talk to us at ISSA, and we are happy to do a courtesy review of that offer and advise you to the best of our abilities about what your next steps are in terms of potentially getting work authorization. So what are the different types of employment that you might pursue using curricular practical training? So this could be something like regular employment. You have, a 9 to 5 job that you're going to be doing over the summer. You're completing an I-9, which means that you're formally presenting your work authorization. You're getting hired. Something like an internship with compensation. If you're doing just like maybe it's a 4-week internship over the winter break, something like that would still require work authorization. If you're doing an internship for a company out in California and you're working remotely, you will still need work authorization. If you're doing the work from physically Notre Dame's campus, but you're being paid by a company out in California, that is not considered on-campus employment just because you are physically on campus doing the work. The main question that we ask in that scenario is who's paying you? And if somebody besides the University of Notre Dame is paying you, that is considered off-campus employment for immigration purposes. So even remote work would be off-campus employment and would therefore require work authorization. If you're publishing and you're getting compensation, this would be something that you need to get authorization for. Again, publishing a book is not exactly a job in the way that we typically think of a job. But if you are publishing something and then you're receiving money for that work that you're publishing, that is employment in the eyes of the US government. And so therefore, again, would require authorization. If you're presenting at a conference and they're giving you, a stipend, or they're giving you some sort of honorarium to thank you for presenting at the conference, that is still an exchange of services. You're still getting compensation for work that you've done. So we would still advise getting work authorization. So CPT and the degree requirements. So again, I've mentioned many times at this point that CPT is curricular practical training. So it is employment authorization that is based in the needs of your academic program. So CPT supports completion of the degree requirements. Again, an example of that would be that you're enrolling in your program's internship course, and let's say you enroll in 1 credit, that 1 credit is helping you meet your graduation requirement threshold for credits. So it just has to be somehow supporting that degree completion. Again, it is not meant to just facilitate your desire to work. Of course, we understand that internships are a really important part of an undergraduate or graduate experience. However, the need for this employment has to come from the academics and not your desire to work. You must remain enrolled in the class linked to your CPT. So again, typically CPT authorization is going to be tied to a course that you're enrolled in for the semester. Typically, you're enrolled in the course in the semester that you're planning to work. There are a few exceptions to that, which I'll get to in just a moment. And so you'll have to remain enrolled in that class for the duration of that semester that we're basing that CPT authorization on. So again, course enrollment must be in the same semester as the training opportunity. There are few scenarios in which, particularly if you have a summer internship, where the internship course is not offered in the summer. And so in that case, we allow what's called adjacent semester enrollment, which means that you could potentially apply for CPT in the summertime based on an internship course that you're going to be enrolled in the spring. And there will be some sort of evaluation in that course in the spring semester of the work that in the fall. If you were doing a summer internship and you were going to enroll in the following fall semester, then that course in the fall semester would have some sort of evaluation, assessment, something like that, of the work that you did in the summer. So we do allow adjacent semester enrollment specifically in the context if the internship course is not offered in the semester that you will be doing the work that you're authorized to do with your CPT. CPT cannot delay the completion of your academic program. So you have to graduate once you complete your degree requirements. And again, there are work authorization options like OPT for after you graduate, but you cannot request CPT and then have that internship delay your normal graduation time. So it may impact ISSA's ability to process a program extension if your program completion was delayed because you were working. Again, it's just generally a good idea to remember that as an F1 student, your primary purpose in the United States is study and not employment. So CPT authorization is typically done on a semester by semester basis. So CPT will not be authorized in most circumstances for one semester at a time. For more than one semester at a time, which means that if you have, let's say that you can take 2 credits of internship in your program and you take one in the spring semester and one in the summer, you would have to submit a new CPT request in order to continue that employment in the summer semester. Again, we authorize CPT for a particular employer for a particular period of time. So if you're going to go beyond that date, you would need to resubmit a CPT request. In your final semester, it's important to understand that your CPT authorization has to end on or before the program end date listed on your I-20, which makes sense because, as we mentioned, CPT is only authorized before you graduate. So if you are graduating in spring 2025 and you have CPT in that spring semester, then I think the graduation date is May 18th of 2025. If that's your I-20 program end date, then we would not be able to authorize you for CPT past that May 18th, 2025 end date. And then if you plan to continue working in the summer, you would have to apply for OPT. So after learning all of this information about curricular practical training, the next question is, how do I know if I'm eligible for CPT? So the eligibility requirements for CPT. You're eligible to apply for CPT if you have maintained your lawful F1 status. Presumably, that's most of you. If you are not maintaining status, ISSA will be in communication with you. So presumably, you've been maintaining your lawful F1 status. The second one is that you've been enrolled full-time for at least one academic year at that education level. So if you just started your program in fall 2023, then you would not be eligible for any sort of off-campus employment authorization until summer 2024. You have to have completed a spring and a fall semester or a fall and a spring semester in order to be eligible for any sort of off-campus work authorization like CPT. There's a little asterisk there because there are some exceptions to that academic year requirement. The first one is if you did your undergraduate degree in the United States and you transferred from another U.S. institution where you were already enrolled full-time for at least an academic year, and then you transferred to Notre Dame for graduate school, in that case, that academic year requirement will have been met. If you're a bachelor student and you did your first 2 years at another school in the US and then you transferred here for the remaining part of your bachelor's degree, again, that would satisfy that one academic year requirement. There is also an exception for graduate students if your program requires that you do off-campus work and you need CPT. right away in your program. I will say those are very few and far between, and ISSA is aware of them, but there may be that scenario as well. However, for most students, you need to have completed a spring and a fall semester in your program before you're going to be eligible to apply for CPT. You have to be registered in a corresponding course during the semester in which CPT is authorized. We've already talked about the enrollment requirement. So again, CPT is typically based on course enrollment in an internship course in your program. And lastly, you have to have a written offer of employment from a company, and the position has to be directly related to your major area of study. So at the time that you request CPT, you're going to be asked to upload an offer letter that is going to have to confirm who you're working for, where you're going to be working, whether it's full-time or part-time, the expected start date of your employment. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, if you have a double major, then you could potentially pursue CPT in either one of those majors. You cannot have CPT based on a minor. It has to be directly related to your major field of study. I do also want to note for those of you who may be or who may have a double major, that if you are applying for CPT based on one of the majors, that means that the course enrollment that you're pursuing has to also be in that program. It has to be in that major's department. So you can't enroll in a course in one of your majors and then work in a field that is related to your second major. So the academic and the immigration. It is very important to understand that there are both academic and immigration restrictions that impact your eligibility for CPT. So of course, we've already mentioned some of the immigration restrictions, things like it has to be related to your major field of study, you have to have completed an academic year before you become eligible, but there are also some academic restrictions. An example of this is for undergraduate students who are in the College of Science. Most of the time, the College of Science has very, very strict criteria for approving something like off-campus work authorization. And the reason for that is because of things like they will not allow you to get credit and payment for the same position. So for students in the College of Science, undergraduate students, CPT is often not possible. Another example is for PhD students. PhD students will typically only be eligible for CPT if what they're doing is counting towards their dissertation or helping them complete their dissertation. They can't just do a random internship. And so there are some of these academic restrictions that you will need to consider as well in your eligibility for CPT authorization. And then, as we mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, not all programs have a CPT option. CPT is not a given just because you're pursuing a program as an F1 student. An example of this is the Mendoza Specialized Master's programs. A lot of those one-year programs, there's no space in those programs for an internship course. They're often accelerated programs, and so there is no CPT option for students in those specialized master's programs. Again, if you have specific questions about whether or not your program has a CPT option or an internship option, then it's a good idea to be in communication both with ISSA, but also with your academic advisor. So if CPT isn't an option, so let's say that you're in a program where you are not eligible to apply for CPT, then you may be eligible to apply for what's called pre-completion OPT. So earlier in the session, we mentioned that OPT is a kind of work authorization for F1 students that can be authorized either pre-completion, meaning before you complete the program, or post-completion, meaning after you complete the program. There are a few important things to note about pre-completion OPT because it's not necessarily going to be a solution for everyone. The first thing to note is that the work still has to be related to your major field of study. As an F1 student, almost all kinds of off-campus work authorization will require that the work you're doing is related to the degree that you earned from your university. The second item is that the time that you use on pre-completion OPT is deducted from the overall 12 months of OPT. So you're eligible for at least 12 months of OPT, If you use pre-completion OPT, then you're losing some of that time off of the 12 months that you can use after you graduate. It is a separate application fee. So as we mentioned, OPT is a kind of authorization that is approved by the US government and not by ISSA, whereas CPT is approved by ISSA. So there is a government filing fee along with this OPT application that you would have to pay if you decided to apply for pre-completion OPT. And the timing can also be very tricky. And the reason is because you can only apply for pre-completion OPT 90 days or approximately 3 months in advance of your requested start date. It is also taking approximately 3 months for USCIS to approve OPT applications. And so because of that, you would have to know at least 3 months in advance what exactly, or first, that you had an offer of employment, and second, when you wanted to request your start date to be for OPT. And so sometimes the timing of that kind of employment authorization doesn't work out for students. Again, you can only apply 90 days before your requested start date. And then if you're not approved in time to pursue the job that you want, you're still losing that time from your 12 months. It's kind of a use it or lose it with OPT. So if you don't find a job or you aren't able to do the job that you wanted because your authorization didn't get approved in time, you're still losing that time off of your 12 months of OPT. All of this is to say is that if you think about applying for pre-completion OPT, definitely 100% talk to ISSA first so that we can best advise you. And then the final point of this slide is at the bottom here. You may not be able to accept this position. And while I know that's not always great to hear, we at ISSA always have your best interests at heart. And so when we're advising you on something, we're thinking about your long-term future and your long-term immigration aspirations, I suppose. So something that seems like a good idea now may actually impact you 10 years from now. And so that's what we're thinking about when we're advising you. So the final point is that you may not be able to accept this position and that you should always talk to ISSA before signing any contracts. There's nothing worse than signing a contract and then having to go back to your employer and say that actually you're not able to move forward because you don't have work authorization. So always talk to ISSA first. So a few case studies to kind of provide some examples here, and we can kind of open it up in the chat for you all to answer. So the first example is a student working from campus, but for a national broadcasting company as a cameraman for a sporting event on campus. Do you guys think that this is going to require authorization? Feel free to put yes or no in the chat. I'll give you 15 seconds. Yes, great. If you answered yes, you're correct. Amazing. And the reason for this is because even though they're working from Notre Dame's campus, their employer, the person paying them, is this broadcasting company. And so something like this would still require off-campus work authorization because it is for a non-Notre Dame employer. So great work. So the next one, I will not make you do this for all of them, but I do appreciate the engagement. So the second one is that a student is in their home country working for a US company. So does the student require work authorization? In this case, the answer is actually no, because we care about the work that you're doing while you are physically in the United States. So if you are outside of the United States working remotely for a US-based company, then you do not need US-based work authorization. So if you are working from your home country outside of the United States, then this is not, you would not need US-based work authorization for some sort of opportunity like that. The next example is something like the Silicon Valley semester internship or an internship through the Idea Center that is sponsored by Notre Dame but paid by the startup. Again, even if the Silicon Valley internship program, even though it is operated through Notre Dame, if you're doing an internship as part of that program, there's also a Washington, D.C. program of a similar nature. Even though it's sponsored by Notre Dame, the company that you're working for is not Notre Dame. And so the money that you're receiving is from an off-campus entity. And so it would therefore require CPT authorization. This is a similar situation we run into with the Idea Center, where there are a lot of startups that are operated through the Idea Center, but are not paid by the University of Notre Dame. And so sometimes you're not going to be eligible for on-campus employment for those kinds of positions. They would actually require off-campus employment authorization, like CPT, for example. Another example is our sacred music program for students who are singing at various parishes, every weekend singing at a different church, for example, and receiving payment for that. Even though this isn't like an internship, this is still an exchange of services for compensation. And so this is still employment and would still require some sort of work authorization. So things like gig work or like really short-term employment, stuff like that would still require work authorization. So now that we've talked about kind of what CPT is and what makes you eligible for CPT, let's get into how exactly you apply for it. If you have consulted with your academic department, you've consulted with ISSA, you have a job in hand, an offer in hand, and you're ready to go, how do you move forward? So step one, you've already done it. Congratulations. You have viewed the CPT information session hosted by ISSA. Step two, you have to have a written offer of employment from your employer. And we list these bullet points here for what that particular letter should contain. This information, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, is also listed out very plainly on our webpage. So you don't have to memorize it. It is also listed out there as well. But this is the information that that letter should confirm. I will note that an offer letter may not necessarily contain all of this information, and you may need to follow up with your employer to request an employment confirmation letter or something that has all of this listed out. So next step is to meet with your academic advisor, if you haven't already, to discuss the offer, your department requirements, and making sure that you are going to be enrolled in the appropriate internship course in your program. Again, the course should be related to the work that you're doing. The work that you're doing should help you meet the objectives of that class. It should be listed in the Notre Dame catalog, and it does have to be for at least half a credit, half to 1 credit. It cannot be for 0 credits. It is likely to be called internship, practicum, or independent study. Any of these would be fine. Again, we typically have on file the courses that are eligible for CPT, but if you have specific questions, then definitely direct them to your academic advisor. If you're a graduate student, then maybe you enroll in research credit hours. If the CPT employment is going to count towards your master's thesis or your, for doctoral students, your dissertation. So if you're already enrolled in research and dissertation credits, you don't have to enroll in an extra class. You can apply for CPT for your research based on your research and dissertation course enrollment. And then let your advisor know that they will need to formally sign off on your request in ISSA link. Most advisors already know this because you are probably not the first student who has applied for CPT and had that person sign off on it. However, the one thing I want to point out is that if you are applying for CPT pretty close to when you want to start working, and that timeline is going to be really tight, I would let your advisor know that it's a time-sensitive request. A lot of times, the main delay in our ability to process a CPT request is that the advisor has not yet signed off on that request. And so if this is something that is very time-sensitive, it would be worth it to let your advisor know that they should expect this, this request for them to approve this form. The next step is to complete the ISSA CPT application in ISSALink. So you can navigate to issalink.nd.edu. I put a screenshot here of what you're going to see. On the left-hand panel, there is an F1 practical training option. And within that option, you will see one of the e-forms is called curricular practical training. That will be the request that you need to submit. Also part of step 4, in terms of completing that application, you will be asked to input your employment information, the details of where you're working, where the work is going to be done, like the site address of that employment, whether it's full-time or part-time. And then you're going to be asked, as I mentioned, to input your academic or your faculty advisor's name and email address. After you hit submit, an email is automatically going to be generated to that person, and that is how they are going to sign off. They click a link in that email, and that's how we receive their approval. As part of this application, you are going to have to upload two documents. The first one is your I-94 record. You can Google I-94 and the government website will be the first option that comes up. And then you will click the button that says Get Most Recent I-94. If you haven't looked up the I-94 from your most recent entry to the US, I would recommend just going ahead and doing it now. It's always good to keep that on your, it's always good to keep that for your records. And then the second document that you're going to have to upload to the CPT application is the employment confirmation letter with all of that information that we mentioned in the previous slide. Again, we cannot process that application until we receive both your information and the confirmation from your advisor. So our processing time cannot start until we have that whole complete application. A lot of times students follow up and they're like, hey, I've been waiting a week. I don't know where my I-20 is, but I need to start working next week. Can you help me? And the reason that we haven't been able to process it, again, is because we don't have the advisor confirmation yet. And then, as I mentioned, please notify the advisor in advance, especially if this is a time-sensitive request. Super important. So next is ISSA processing. Once we have that completed application, we'll go ahead and confirm the enrollment for that semester, make sure that you're enrolled in the proper course. If you're not enrolled in the course, or if the enrollment for the semester that you're going to enroll hasn't opened yet, then we may not be able to continue processing that request until we do see that enrollment. So an example is right now, a lot of students are applying for CPT for summer internships, and they're going to enroll in the internship course in the fall 2024 semester. Well, fall 2024 enrollment is not open yet. So we haven't been able to process those summer internship requests. We won't be able to do that until fall enrollment opens up, and we can confirm that you are enrolled in the appropriate course in the appropriate semester. Once we can confirm all of this information and everything looks good, we're going to go ahead and authorize the CPT, which, as I mentioned, comes in the form of a new I-20 with the CPT endorsement on page 2. This is going to be sent as an email attachment to you. We're going to approve the request that you sent, and we're going to send you an email with the I-20 attached as a PDF. Again, it's going to have digital signatures. However, you will need to print it out and hand sign it. This will serve as your work authorization document. So when you're going to your employer and they're asking you to present proof of your work authorization, this is that work authorization, and you're going to have to present that CPT I-20 to them. Just a note that a letter, a signature, or a verbal approval from another office or department on campus does not constitute employment authorization for immigration purposes. What this means is that as an international student in F1 status, the only way that you are authorized for CPT is with this new I-20 with the CPT authorization on it. So just because the person leading a trip tells you that the work that you're going to be doing doesn't need work authorization, or that it's going to be fine because you're a Notre Dame student, please still come check with ISSA. Better safe than sorry. Always best to confirm. If you have any questions, definitely come talk to ISSA first. And then step 6, the final step, is to present that Form I-20 with the CPT authorization to your employer. It's proof of your employment authorization, and this is what you will present, as I mentioned, to complete that onboarding process, the I-9 process to determine your work eligibility in the US. So another point that we want to bring up here is with regards to remote work. So we get a lot of questions about remote work under CPT. So current US government guidance says that students can engage in remote work while they're on CPT, as long as these requirements are met. They are enrolled in a program of study in which CPT is integral to the program of study. As we mentioned, this is a component of being eligible for CPT. So you would already have that if we had authorized you for CPT. The second bullet point is that ISSA has authorized the CPT before the position start date. And the third is that your employer can assess your engagement in that internship or that period of employment through electronic means. So as long as they can still be assessing your work and your learning objectives in that internship while you're working remotely, then remote work is okay on CPT. If you're going to pursue CPT remotely, it is important that you keep good documentation of this and that you keep documentation of how your supervisor was assessing your work. This could be something like an evaluation. This could be something like a letter from your supervisor or your employer confirming how they're going to be monitoring the work that you're doing remotely. But you should have good documentation of any employment that you pursue. Second, the offer letter should mention that it's a remote position, but it should also provide an actual work address for where the employer is housed. So it should mention that this is a remote position, and it should also have an office address on the offer letter. And then just a note that even if you're working remotely, you're going to be asked to provide the address of where this remote work is going to be happening at the time that you request the CPT I-20. So there is a question on the CPT request form that asks about the site address. If you are going to be working remotely from your apartment, then in this situation, you would go ahead and list your full US address in that situation. So a general timeline and some reminders. Submit the CPT application at least 2 weeks in advance of your start date. The reason that we say at least 2 weeks, and you can submit it sooner if you have all the documentation sooner, but the reason that we say at least 2 weeks is because this will allow a little bit of a grace period if we have to do any sort of follow-up, if there's any delay in your advisor being able to approve the form. And that way you're not super stressed that you're supposed to start working tomorrow and you don't have your CPT authorization yet. So again, we ask that you submit it at least 2 weeks in advance of your requested CPT start date. If you have all the information, you can apply earlier. This is particularly important if you're planning to start working pretty soon after a holiday, a long weekend, something where we're going to be really busy during those time periods. We would really appreciate a little bit of extra time to be able to process that request for you. It's also stressful for us when you have a request that needs to be expedited because we want to help you. And so we don't want to feel rushed. We don't want you to feel rushed. And so always best to apply as early as possible. ISSA may require follow-up from you or your academic advisor. As I mentioned, this is one of the biggest delays in the CPT process. If we are not able to process your CPT request by your requested start date, very important to keep in mind that you are not eligible to begin working until you have that authorization. So if your employer asks that you start working on May 31st and you don't have your CPT I-20 until June 5th, then you cannot begin working until June 5th, and you'll have to tell your employer that you don't have your work authorization yet. We will make every effort to assist you in being able to pursue your employment on time. But sometimes things happen, students apply late, we can't get a hold of the advisor, there's an enrollment issue. And so please always keep in mind that you are not eligible to begin working until you have that I-20 in hand and you're within those CPT authorization dates. We cannot backdate work authorization. What this means is that if you started working on May 31st and we did not get your CPT authorization to you until June 5th, this means we can't go back and backdate the authorization. We can't make it so that you had authorization on May 31st. So that's why it's so important for you to always make sure that you're not working outside of that authorization period. I also advise students, if we get the I-20 to you on June 5th and your offer letter says your start date was May 31st, I always advise students to get an updated offer letter. You never want there to be any sort of documentation that you were working outside of the authorization dates. So always good to make sure that all of your documentation aligns, that the start date listed on your offer letter aligns with the start date of your CPT authorization. So just one final time to reiterate, employment off campus cannot begin until you have received an I-20 from ISSA that has the CPT authorization on page 2. And second, the start date of that authorization has been reached. So if you get your CPT authorization on May 15th, but the authorization doesn't start until May 31st, that means you cannot start working until May 31st. Again, check those dates, check the information on the I-20 when we give it to you, which is a good rule of thumb all the time. You should always be checking the information on the I-20 when we issue it to you. So again, just to reiterate these main takeaways, first, off-campus employment activities require work authorization. There's a whole host of activities that require work authorization. Be sure to talk to ISSA before accepting or pursuing any sort of off-campus activity. Any employment that you're pursuing off-campus must be related to your major, as listed on your I-20. CPT is based on your academic curriculum and not your desire to work. Not all programs have the option for CPT. So please, if you remember anything from today's presentation, remember these 5 bullet points. If you have any questions about this information, or in the future, if you have an opportunity and you want to talk to ISSA about it, we have a lot of ways that you can reach us for advising. You can always send us an email. You can reserve a virtual appointment. We have drop-in advising. We have in-person walk-in advising, and you can get a hold of us in any one of these ways, and we're happy to assist you. That's all that we have for tonight's presentation. If you have any questions, Dulce and I are going to stick around. Thank you so much for attending. And as I mentioned, this recording will be available on our webpage, hopefully by the end of this week.